The modal argument from evil. Let's look at an argument from evil that is completely independent of there being any evil in the world. Here's the chain of reasoning. God is usually defined as a necessary being. That is, God exists in all possible worlds. Thus, the only logically consistent stances about God are that he exists in all possible worlds or none of them. It is incoherent to say that a being who exists in all possible worlds exists in only some possible worlds. So, with God, it's all or nothing. Now, if God exists in all possible worlds, then he is the actualizer of every possible world. That is, he helps bring about the stuff going on in those possible worlds. We can also note that due to the moral perfection of God, he cannot do immoral acts. Thus, in all possible worlds, God is not doing something immoral by actualizing those possible worlds. The argument now is that it seems possible for reality to have been some way such that the amount of badness outweighs the amount of goodness there is. That is, there seems to be a possible world where there is more bad than good. Does God exist in such a possible world? Well, the actualization of a world with more bad than good in it is an immoral act. So, since God never does anything immoral, he can't be in that world actualizing it. God does not exist in that possible world. But remember, since our options are God exists in all possible worlds and God exists in no possible worlds, we're forced to conclude that God exists in no possible worlds. Now, the most obvious point of attack against this argument is this idea that there even is a possible world where the amount of badness outweighs the amount of goodness. How could a skeptic even defend this key premise in their argument? Well, here's two lines of defense. First, it just seems intuitive that it would be possible. Like, I can imagine a world full of people being tortured forever, and that doesn't seem impossible. Our modal intuitions lead us to think that such a possible world could exist. Another route that could be taken is by invoking a recombination principle. A recombination principle essentially allows you to pick out some parts of different possible worlds and conclude that there is a possible world where those parts exist together. So, if there's a possible world where a turtle exists, and a possible world where a handsome square-headed fellow exists, then there is a possible world containing both a turtle and a square-headed fellow. That's the basic idea. What kind of possible worlds you think there are depends on the kind of recombination principle you accept. But once you accept one, you should plausibly be able to take the worst evils imaginable from a bunch of different possible worlds and combine them together to make one ultra-evil possible world. Now, the theist could respond to these defenses in a very straightforward manner. If there is enough independent evidence for God, they could simply deny that our modal intuitions are accurate, and they could also deny that most recombination principles are true. There's nothing wrong with that. There's already a ton of skepticism towards our modal intuitions and recombination principles, so the theist might as well jump on that bandwagon. However, there is another way. Let's now look at indeterminism. Indeterminism occurs whenever an event has multiple possible outcomes, like with randomness or free will. Indeterminism is pretty cool because it generates possible worlds for free. The different outcomes of indeterministic events, by definition, could occur, so we need different possible worlds for them to occur in. Actually, if you look at the branching timeline with all the different branches being generated by indeterminism, you can have a nice account of what possible worlds actually are by identifying them with the branches on the timeline. With that in mind, let's explore a thought experiment. God makes the super powerful angel Azrael, who has such a nature that he could either make a good universe or the ultra-evil one we discovered with our recombination principle. Both are live options that Azrael has a chance of doing. So if God can make Azrael, then there really is an ultra-evil possible world. But can God make Azrael? Wouldn't it be immoral? Well, no. God could definitely make Azrael because God's intentions would be for Azrael to make the good universe, not the ultra-evil one. You may object that God would be doing something immoral by creating Azrael because he is allowing for the risk of such a terrible universe when he could go about getting a good universe in less risky ways. However, a theist could adopt Molinism, the view that God has knowledge of the outcomes of indeterministic events before they happen. Under Molinism, there is the possibility of Azrael's actualizing the ultra-evil possible world, but God isn't taking any risk because he knows in advance the outcome of Azrael's choice. So, God definitely could be morally justified in creating Azrael. One could now object that this means that the ultra-evil possible world isn't possible in the truest sense, because if God knew that Azrael would have made the ultra-evil universe, then God wouldn't have made Azrael. So the ultra-evil possible world isn't very possible-worldy. Now, I personally disagree with this reasoning. I think that just because it wouldn't ever happen doesn't mean that it couldn't ever happen. But another route that the theist could take is accepting that the branching timeline generated by the outcomes of indeterministic events isn't really representative of the possible worlds. They're the causally possible worlds, which are different from the really possible worlds. Since the ultra-evil possible world wouldn't be allowed by God, but it is on the branching timeline, then it is a causally possible world and not a really possible world. But once such a distinction has been made, the theist could maintain that our modal intuitions and recombination principles are actually true, but only when applied to the causally possible worlds. So as I mentioned earlier, the theist can outright deny the central premise of the modal argument from evil, that there is a possible world with more bad than good, or they can be fancy and accept its possibility, but nuance the meaning of this so that it's unproblematic. Either way defeats the argument. That's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this content.